There are moments in history where the most powerful truths are not spoken out loud. They are stitched into silence, hidden in plain sight, and today you are about to hear the story of a woman who stood closer to power than almost anyone else, yet lived her life unseen. She was born enslaved, with no freedom, no protection, no voice in the world she entered, and yet through discipline, skill, and unbreakable control, she walked into the most guarded rooms of a divided nation, not as a guest, not as a spectator, but as someone trusted, someone relied upon, someone who heard what others were never meant to hear, a woman who once belonged to someone else, now standing inches away from the highest power in the land, touching the fabric worn at state events, listening as grief, fear, ambition, and collapse spilled into private conversations. She witnessed history not from a distance, but from the inside, and she carried those moments with her for over 50 years. She stayed silent while empires shifted, while reputations were built and destroyed, while the world wrote its version of events without her voice included. And the question is not just what she saw. The question is why she waited so long to tell the truth. In this video you will learn how an enslaved woman used a single skill to escape bondage, how discipline became her shield, how silence became her survival, and how being close to power is often more dangerous than being far from it. You will discover what it meant to live inside the White House during the Civil War, to witness personal collapse behind public strength, to carry secrets that could destroy lives, including your own, and you will understand why speaking too soon would have cost her everything. This is not just a story about history, it is a lesson about timing, about restraint, about knowing when to move and when to remain still. It is about how the most important witnesses are often the ones history tries to erase. By the end of this video you will see power differently. You will understand silence differently, and you will never again assume that the people standing quietly in the background know nothing. Some stories wait decades to be told. Some truths survive only because someone was strong enough to hold them. Stay with this story until the end, because once you see what she carried you will understand why she could never speak too soon. Before we talk about the world she would later enter, we have to return to the one she was born into. She came into life in Virginia, not as a child with choices but as property. Her body, her time, and her future were claimed before she could speak. Slavery was not just labor, it was control at every level, control over movement, control over thought, control over silence. From the beginning she learned that survival depended on obedience, not because it was right, but because resistance came with consequences that were swift and brutal. Before we talk about skill, opportunity, or proximity to power, we must understand the environment that shaped her mind. Enslaved people lived under constant observation. Every gesture was watched, every word was measured, punishment was unpredictable, and often used as a warning to others. Physical abuse was common, but psychological control ran even deeper. Fear was not accidental, it was designed, and growing up in this system taught her an early lesson that would follow her for life. Speak less, observe more, remember everything. Before we talk about her strength, we have to acknowledge what was taken from her. As a young girl, she experienced violence that no child should ever know. Her body was not protected, her pain was not questioned, and justice did not exist for someone in her position. These moments did not make her weak, they made her precise. They taught her that emotional reactions invited danger, that silence could be a form of protection, that control of the self was sometimes the only power available. Before we talk about freedom, we must look at discipline. Enslaved life demanded it. Waking before dawn, working without rest, performing under pressure while appearing calm. Over time, discipline stopped being something imposed from the outside. It became internal. She learned to regulate her voice, her posture, her reactions. This was not submission, it was strategy. She understood that those who appeared composed were punished less. Those who blended into expectations survived longer. Before we talk about the woman history remembers, we must see the girl who was trained to disappear. She learned how to be present without being noticed, how to listen without responding, how to carry knowledge without revealing it. These habits did not fade when slavery ended. They followed her into every room she would later enter. They shaped how she spoke, how she worked, and how she protected herself around people with power. Before we talk about the silence she kept later in life, we need to see where it began. Silence was not emptiness. It was awareness. It was restraint built from experience. In a world where one wrong word could change everything, she learned that survival was not about being loud, it was about being exact. And those early years in Virginia carved that understanding into her long before history ever learned her name. Before we talk about independence, we have to talk about the needle. Sewing was not a choice given to her. It was assigned, forced, learned under pressure, not passion. In enslaved households, skills were extracted early. Children were trained to produce value as soon as their hands could move with purpose. For her, sewing became that expectation. Long hours, dim light, constant correction. Mistakes were not part of learning. They were treated as defiance. Every stitch had to be perfect, not for pride, but for survival. Before we talk about mastery, we need to understand the conditions. Sewing was done while standing, while exhausted, while being watched. There was no room for creativity, only precision. Clothing had to fit bodies she did not belong to. Dresses for women who lived lives completely opposite to her own. Through this work, she learned more than technique. She learned patience, timing, control of breath, the discipline to stay focused even when her body wanted to stop. These lessons were not written, they were carved into muscle memory. Before we talk about opportunity, we must see how sewing quietly shifted her position. Unlike field labor, skilled domestic work placed her indoors, closer to decision makers, closer to conversations. Sewing rooms were not just workspaces, they were places where people spoke freely, assuming no one was listening. While her hands moved, her mind recorded everything. Sewing taught her how to exist in silence while absorbing information. This ability would later become just as valuable as the skill itself. Before we talk about freedom, we must acknowledge the burden of talent. Her skill made her valuable, but also trapped. The better she became, the harder it was to be released. Owners profited from her precision. Her labor created wealth she would never touch. Yet within that contradiction, something important formed. Sewing gave her leverage. It created demand. It made her useful beyond brute labor. And usefulness in that world was the first step toward negotiation. Before we talk about escape, we must talk about vision. Sewing exposed her to quality, to structure, to standards that separated ordinary work from exceptional work. She understood that excellence could open doors, violence never could. Over time she began to see sewing not just as labor, but as currency. Each completed garment strengthened her reputation. Each satisfied client increased her value. Quietly, without announcement, she was building a future she could not yet claim. Before we talk about the life she would later live, we must understand how sewing became a bridge between bondage and autonomy, between being used and being needed. The needle that once symbolized control slowly became a tool of strategy. It allowed her to imagine a life where her hands worked for her, not against her. And even though the conditions were cruel, the skill itself carried possibility. In a system designed to erase futures, sewing became the one thing that could not be taken from her. Before we talk about freedom, we have to talk about years of endurance. Saving money while enslaved was not normal. It was not encouraged. It was barely permitted. Every coin she earned existed under supervision. Every payment passed through hands that were not hers. She worked longer than required, took on extra sewing, accepted exhaustion as routine, not to rest, not to complain, but to slowly gather what most enslaved people were never allowed to imagine. Before we talk about opportunity, we need to understand the system working against her. Wages were often withheld, promises were broken without consequence, prices for freedom were inflated without logic. Owners controlled the rules, and changed them whenever it benefited them. She knew this. That knowledge did not stop her. It sharpened her focus. She tracked every expense, measured every earning, learned how to negotiate quietly without drawing attention to her goal. Before we talk about the decision, we must talk about time. Years passed, seasons changed, her body aged under pressure, sewing by candlelight, working while sick, producing at a pace that left little room for weakness. The money came slowly, painfully, but it came. Each small amount represented another step away from ownership, another inch of control reclaimed. And through it all, she carried one thought with her. Freedom would not be given, it had to be bought. Before we talk about the act itself, we must understand how rare it was. Purchasing one's freedom was uncommon. Purchasing freedom for a child was even rarer. The cost was enormous, not just in money, but in risk. One wrong moment could erase everything. One refusal could end years of work. When the time finally came, she handed over what amounted to a lifetime of labor, a sum that represented youth, health, and uncounted hours of restraint. Before we talk about relief, we must talk about loss. The moment of freedom was not pure celebration. It carried weight. Fear did not disappear. Security was not guaranteed. She was free, but with no savings left, no safety net, no protection beyond her skill. She had traded everything she had accumulated for the right to belong to herself and her son. That decision required a level of courage few ever had to summon. Before we talk about what came next, we must recognize the emotional cost. Freedom arrived with responsibility. Every mistake now had consequences. Every failure would be her own. But even with uncertainty ahead, the choice was clear. She had paid the highest price imaginable, and in doing so she proved that freedom was not an abstract idea. It was something she earned stitch by stitch, year by year, with a discipline that refused to break. Before we talk about influence, we have to talk about Washington. The city was not just a capital, it was a pressure point. Power moved through its streets every day. Politicians, generals, diplomats, and opportunists all crossed paths in a place where decisions could change the nation overnight. For a free black woman, Washington offered possibility, but it also carried constant risk. Laws were unstable, racial hostility was visible. Freedom could exist on paper and still be threatened in practice. Before we talk about access, we need to understand the danger. Washington sat between slave states and free states. Spies moved quietly. Tensions stayed high. Kidnappings of free black people were not rare. One accusation could end a life. One wrong association could draw suspicion. The city promised opportunity, but it demanded caution. Survival depended on awareness, not optimism, and she understood that the same streets that opened doors could also close them without warning. Before we talk about success, we must look at how she moved. She did not announce herself. She did not demand space. She entered elite circles the only way available to her. Through usefulness, through excellence. Her sewing spoke before she did. Quality traveled faster than reputation. Dresses passed from woman to woman. Recommendations were whispered. She let her work open doors she could not push herself. Before we talk about proximity, we must understand discretion. Elite homes were filled with talk. Politics mixed with personal fears. Arguments about the future of the country happened over dinner tables and behind closed doors. She was present, but not acknowledged as a participant. That invisibility became protection. She heard plans, doubts, confessions, and she learned how to exist without reacting. Washington rewarded those who listened more than they spoke. Before we talk about power, we must introduce the moment in history. The Civil War was approaching. The city felt it before the first shots were fired. Anxiety filled the air. Loyalties were questioned. Friendships were tested. Every household carried uncertainty. Clothing itself became political. What one wore signaled allegiance, confidence, or mourning. In this environment, her skill became essential. Appearances mattered more than ever. Before we talk about her rise, we must recognize restraint. She navigated spaces where one mistake could erase everything she had built. She observed without aligning publicly. She worked without commenting. She understood that access was fragile. In a city balancing on the edge of collapse, she learned how to stand close to power without becoming a target. Washington did not reward boldness from someone like her. It rewarded precision, and she mastered it. Before we talk about loyalty, we have to talk about trust. Trust was not easily given in Washington, especially during a time when every word could be repeated and every relationship examined. She did not gain trust through flattery or attention. She earned it through consistency. Dresses were delivered on time. Details were flawless. Promises were kept without reminders. In a world filled with uncertainty, reliability became rare, and rare things were valued. Before we talk about closeness, we need to understand presence. She did not behave like someone seeking approval. She stayed composed, focused, calm. While others reacted emotionally to pressure, she remained steady. That steadiness mattered. It created a sense of safety. When everything else felt unstable, her work did not change. Her tone did not change. That reliability slowly became something deeper than professionalism. Before we talk about connection, we must acknowledge vulnerability. Mary Lincoln carried immense pressure. Public scrutiny followed her constantly. Grief lived close to the surface. Loss had already shaped her life before the war intensified. In private spaces, emotions surfaced that could never appear in public. The dressmaker became someone who witnessed these moments without judgment. She listened without correcting. She supported without advising unless asked. This created a bond built on discretion rather than sympathy. Before we talk about intimacy, we must recognize access. Fittings required time alone. Repeated visits created routine. Routine created familiarity. Over time, conversations moved beyond fabric and fitting. Fear was spoken. Frustration was released. The dressmaker became someone who saw the First Lady without the title attached. Not a symbol. A person. That shift was powerful. It changed the nature of their relationship. Before we talk about how unusual this bond was, we need to place it in context. A formerly enslaved black woman and the First Lady of the United States were not expected to share trust. Society demanded distance. Race, class, and status were designed to prevent closeness. Yet within private rooms those barriers softened, not erased, but temporarily ignored. The bond did not follow the rules of the time. That alone made it fragile. Before we talk about influence, we must understand restraint. She never used closeness as leverage. She never revealed private moments for advantage. That silence protected both of them. Trust deepened because it was never tested. In an era defined by suspicion and division, their relationship stood out quietly, not because it was public, but because it existed at all. Before we talk about history as it is written, we have to talk about history as it is lived. Inside the White House, power did not always look confident. It looked tired, anxious, fractured. She moved through rooms where laughter could turn into silence without warning, where letters arrived daily carrying news of death. Grief was not occasional, it was constant, and she witnessed it up close not as a guest, but as someone expected to remain invisible. Before we talk about leadership, we need to talk about fear. The Civil War created uncertainty that no position could escape. Decisions carried unbearable weight. Every choice meant loss somewhere else. In private spaces, fear surfaced without restraint. Doubt was spoken aloud. Sleeplessness showed on faces. She saw the moments no portrait ever captured, and she understood that authority often trembles when no one is watching. Before we talk about instability, we must recognize the environment. The White House during war was not a place of calm. It was a place of constant interruption. Messengers arrived at all hours. Conversations were cut short. Plans changed overnight. She watched emotions shift with the news, hope rising, then collapsing. These changes were not announced publicly. They happened quietly, behind closed doors where only a few stood close enough to notice. Before we talk about participation, we must understand her position. She did not speak at meetings. She did not advise. She did not comment on strategy. Her role was to observe without reacting, to move through these spaces without altering them. That required discipline. Any display of opinion could be dangerous. Any visible reaction could draw attention. Silence was not absence. It was control. Before we talk about power, we must talk about proximity. She stood near the center of events without ever being acknowledged as part of them. She heard arguments, reconciliations, private reflections, yet her name never appeared in official records connected to those moments. History moved around her, not because she lacked awareness, but because society did not allow her to exist within its narrative. Before we talk about memory, we must see the cost of witnessing. Carrying knowledge without release creates weight. She held stories that could not be shared, emotions that could not be expressed, truths that could not be confirmed. She understood that survival required restraint, and so she remained what history rarely honors, a silent observer of power, present when decisions were formed, absent when credit was given. Before we talk about aftermath, we have to talk about shock. The assassination did not arrive as a distant event. It tore through the city instantly. Washington shifted overnight, streets filled with fear, whispers turned into certainty. Nothing inside the White House felt stable anymore. For those within its walls, the loss was not political first. It was personal. And she witnessed that transformation in real time. Before we talk about grief, we need to understand Mary Lincoln's collapse. The weight she carried before was already heavy. After the assassination, it became unbearable. Public expectations demanded composure. Private reality made that impossible. She moved between disbelief and despair. Nights passed without rest. Tears appeared without warning. The world expected strength, but inside everything had fractured. Before we talk about loyalty, we must talk about presence. Many people disappeared once the position disappeared. Allies withdrew. Support faded. Criticism grew louder. In this isolation, Elizabeth remained, not for recognition, not for protection, but because loyalty once given was not easily withdrawn. She stayed near, offering stability through routine and attention. Even when grief made conversations difficult, her presence did not change. Before we talk about fear, we must acknowledge danger. Association with the Lincolns after the assassination became complicated. Rumors spread, blame searched for targets. Remaining close carried risk, yet she did not step away. She understood that abandoning someone in collapse could cause deeper harm. Silence and consistency became her form of support. Before we talk about endurance, we must understand the emotional cost. Bearing witness to grief without absorbing it completely required control. She listened without correcting, comforted without promising. She allowed sorrow to exist without trying to fix it. That restraint prevented further damage. It preserved dignity when everything else felt exposed. Before we talk about loyalty as a concept, we must see it in action. She stayed through uncertainty, through criticism, through decline. Not because she was required to, but because trust, once built, demanded commitment. In a moment when power vanished and grief took its place, her loyalty revealed its true weight. Before we talk about influence, we have to talk about knowledge. She knew things about the Lincolns that no one else did. Private conversations, hidden fears, personal habits, moments of vulnerability that were never meant to be witnessed by outsiders. These details were not idle curiosities. They were powerful. They revealed the humanity behind the public image. They showed the fragility beneath the authority. And she carried them all quietly, fully aware of their weight. Before we talk about trust, we need to understand the stakes. Knowledge of another person's private life is a responsibility. Sharing it could destroy reputations. Exposing it could cause harm. For her, discretion was not optional. It was essential. Every secret she kept protected her position in the household. Every detail she withheld safeguarded her freedom. And in a world where proximity to power was as dangerous as it was valuable, silence became her shield. Before we talk about strategy, we must talk about observation. She did not participate in political maneuvering. She did not comment on decisions or conflicts. She observed. She remembered. She learned. In doing so, she gained something few others could claim: awareness without exposure. The more she saw, the more she understood how fragile appearances could be. And she understood that one careless word could destroy everything she had worked to achieve. Before we talk about safety, we must recognize the courage and restraint. Choosing silence when you know so much requires discipline. It is easier to speak, to impress, or to explain what you know, but she chose not to. She understood that her survival depended on being invisible in moments where visibility could be fatal. She learned that holding knowledge quietly was sometimes more powerful than any action she could take. Before we talk about legacy, we have to see the purpose of her silence. It was not emptiness. It was protection. It was strategy. It allowed her to maintain access to the Lincolns, to continue her work, and to safeguard her own life. It gave her the ability to move through elite spaces without challenge. It preserved relationships that would have been fragile if trust had been broken. In every stitch, in every fitting, in every private conversation she witnessed, silence was her armor. Before we talk about revelation, we must understand the paradox of power and invisibility. She was close to history without being part of the official record. She saw the truth, but was forbidden from speaking it openly. And yet this restriction allowed her to survive and thrive in ways that few could. In a world designed to silence her completely, she made silence a tool. She made it a choice, and in doing so she transformed a limitation into a strength, turning secrecy into her most vital form of protection. Her story was minimized for decades. History often ignored the voices of women and former slaves, as if their experiences were less important or less real. Records focused on leaders, on men in power, on public events, while the people who lived through those moments quietly, who witnessed the truth up close, were written out. Elizabeth Keckley's life reminds us that history is incomplete when only one perspective is told. Her courage, her discipline, and her insight offer lessons that are still vital today. By listening to her story, we understand not just the past, but the human strength it takes to survive, observe, and protect oneself in a world designed to erase you. If this story moved you or opened your eyes, make sure to like this video and subscribe to our channel. More untold stories and hidden histories are waiting to be discovered.